You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
We live in an era where many are seeking ideological certainty and novelty, where the tried and true methods of the past are scoffed at, cynically seen as too simple-minded, at best, and perhaps woefully bigoted or hateful. Well, as we often do here on the Saving Elephants podcast, we want to encourage the listener to reconsider classical positions. Maybe the men and women who came before us didn't have it all wrong. Maybe we are unlikely to radically discover something new about human nature or morality or politics. And rather than indulging in the sugar high of the political ideology at the moment that seems to tickle our vanities and desires just right, maybe we'd be better off in the long term at taking a more sober, mature approach. I'm your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me in this episode is John Wilsey, whose recent book, Religious Freedom, A Conservative Primer, certainly points us to the more classical tradition. What John refers to as aspirational conservatism, something that is to be strived for but cannot be fully obtained for reasons I will let him explain later in the conversation. John is a professor of church history and philosophy and chair of the church history department at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And he is no stranger to research fellowships at a whole host of conservative organizations from Acton Institute to the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. John and I share an evangelical religious framework, and so it was good talking to someone who I could, with a similar religious background, to try to kick around the idea of where exactly American conservatism either does or does not square directly with Christianity. I think John, while he has a timeless message, is specifically interested in aiming it at the youth, and he still considers we millennials to be the youth, and certainly those younger than we are. And so I think for that reason he's worth listening to, because anyone who can successfully wed our traditions and our past to the present moment is someone who can help anchor not only our political structures, but even our daily lives. So with that, I give you my conversation with John Wilsey.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
I feel like I'm channeling the spirit of Jonah Goldberg when I ask this as the first question, but you've recently written a book. What's your book about?
Well, that's a great question, actually, because everybody says that the book has the wrong title. Everybody tells me that. And my response to that is that I didn't come up with the title. It's not mistitled, but the title is not quite descriptive of the book. The book is not a treatise on religious freedom. The book's called Religious Freedom, A Conservative Primer. It's not a book about religious freedom. It's a book about how to think conservatively, or how to think as a conservative about religion and freedom. I spend a lot of time talking about how conservatives are in the best position to maintain a harmony that Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote in Democracy in America, said that we're America's two spirits, spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty. Conservatives are in the best position to keep that alive, because that's what conservatives do. Conservatives conserve things. We receive, we're conscious of having received a tradition down from those who went before us. And we're also conscious of our duty to steward that tradition and hand it down to those coming after us. That's what we do. Liberals don't do that. Liberals aren't concerned about that. Conservatives are.
Very much so, yes. Conservatives, at least properly understood, I think,
Properly
are
understood.
very
Yes.
concerned about that. And I'm curious because you mentioned liberty and religion. You know, the phrase that's more commonly heard within the fusionist camp, say, of Frank Meyer, is the liberty in order or liberty in tradition.
Mm-hmm.
How does your understanding here of talking about religion differ, or is perhaps the same as that fusionist project?
Mm-hmm. I'd say it's more similar than it is different. I do think that a libertarian would read this book and might not agree with me on everything, on some key points. For example, um, I have a whole chapter on conservatism and ordered liberty, where I argue that in order to have liberty, you have to have order. Order always precedes liberty. And that's a traditionalist view. It was a view, that Russell Kirk famously argued in Roots of American Order, his 1974 book that he wrote, anticipating the bicentennial. I definitely follow Russell Kirk, but also many others in the American conservative tradition, going all the way back to John Adams in that regard. I think a libertarian would say that liberty precedes order, but as a traditionalist conservative, and I think that traditionalist conservatism is the primary tradition of conservatism in American history. I would place order before liberty. And tradition is also, it's what Peter Vurik calls the stoplights, or I think someone else, maybe I can't remember who right now off the top of my head, guardrails that we have as we travel. Um, they direct traffic. Guardrails direct traffic. Guardrails keep us from going over the side of the cliff. They keep us from veering off into the other lane and smashing into somebody else. Tradition is what Russell Kirk said is tradition is how we know what our rights are and how we know what just law is consisting of, because it's what's worked in the past. It's what not just has worked in the past, like the past 50 years, but it's worked for the past 500 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has a tradition shows us what record has, or what those things in our society have a tried and true record. And so we should keep those things alive. We should hand those down to our children. We shouldn't just get rid of them or jettison them. To revere tradition means that you have to have a view of society, like Edmund Burke said, that society is indeed a contract. It is a contract between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. It's not nothing more than a social contract between the living, which is how the liberal tradition looks at it. When I say liberal, I mean, progressive or leftist. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Paine, following Rousseau, both thought that society is only the living. If society is only the living, then what need have we of tradition? And indeed, that was Rousseau's entire point when he opened his book, The Social Contract, with the memorable words, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." What were the chains? Well, tradition is one of the big chains. Tradition, custom, order, social convention, mores, all those things need to be thrown off in order for individuals to fulfill their potential. That's the beginning, really, of modern liberalism. But a view of society as being transcendent, more than just about me, more than just about even my family, or those of us who are alive now. It pertains to those who went before and those who are coming after too.
So I know in certain quarters to equate a libertarian with a Rousseauian would be possibly fighting words, but I get in the sort of broader sense the point you're making. Those who say liberty precedes order, or is more important, or ought to be more deferential. And I'm wondering if we could dig into that idea just a little bit, because I think broadly speaking, what the Rousseauians, what the libertarians, what the I mean, I guess one could even say sort of the Jeffersonians, because I believe he said something to the effect of he believes no one generation knows anything to the other.
Hmm.
What they do
Yeah.
seem to have in common with the notion that liberty precedes order is sort of a historicism that says, look, it was these wars of, and I'm not trying to put words in too many people's mouths because they might describe this different, but they could look around at the world, at history, and say the wars of religion were terrible, and it took us a great deal of time to figure out how to get this sort of secular government just right, which is in effect, yeah, you can have your private religion, but the church can't encroach upon the state in that sort of a governance sense, if you will, like where the popes are anointing kings in effect, and the king's right to rule is seen as a divine authority. That the birthplace of small L liberalism carried on down through even today that we enjoy in the West is what we even have as a claim to liberty is not religion and tradition necessarily. It's actually this putting a check against that religion and tradition. And I know that sounds in stark contrast to, say, the Burkean tradition you're describing, and I call myself a Burkean, but I'm just wondering how you would essentially respond to that basic charge of, well, look, yeah, tradition's important, but you only have liberty if liberty precedes tradition, because tradition itself squelches liberty if, in fact, it comes first.
Well, first of all, I want to be careful to say I would not, based on your comment that you opened the question with, I would not equate a libertarian with a Rousseauian.
Oh, sure.
A liberal, a progressive liberal on the left, yes, yes, but not a libertarian necessarily, unless the libertarian was a liberal. But libertarians can be conservative too, or they can be on the right. So I want to be careful. I don't want to have your listeners automatically turn us off today, or go to another podcast and listen to it instead of this one. And in terms of the question about liberty and tradition, I don't know that. that there is a procession of liberty from tradition or tradition from liberty necessarily. In the same way that order and liberty have to have some kind of a processional relationship. And the reason why I say that is because we have to understand what is freedom. We have to define what freedom is. So we could ask: Is freedom is freedom the fulfilling of one's potential? Is freedom consist in the throwing off of limits? I think a lot of people in the culture today would think that was a pretty good definition of freedom. We're free to throw off our limits. So when Kamala Harris ran for president, she ran under the rubric of freedom, and that's how she was. The Democratic Party were hoping to win over those who maybe voted for Trump and were disillusioned with him, or those who were never Trumpers. Oh, well, freedom. That sounds conservative. That sounds like what Republicans have been talking about for the last 50 years or whatever. But their idea of freedom was, you're free to kill your own babies. You're free to transition your children. You're free to throw off all kinds of restraints on sexual morality and so forth and so on. That's not freedom at all. Freedom can only be understood where there is responsibility. How do you know when you're free in a given situation? How do you know that you're free to pursue a particular ambition? Or how do you know that you're free to travel to a certain place? How do you know if you're free to, pursue a particular career, have a family, have children, operate in your job in ordinary patterns? How do you know when you're free? You know when you're free when you're responsible for the actions that attend the decisions that you make. That's how you know you're free. If you don't have responsibility for something, then you're not free in that particular area. So if freedom and responsibility are entailed in one another, which they are, in the same way that rights and responsibilities in a free society are entailed in one another. So in other words, we live in a free society, but that doesn't mean we just all we do is enjoy privileges. We also have responsibilities to our society, and those are always entailed in one another in a similar way. Freedom and responsibility always go together. And in that regard, tradition and order, these things are necessary in order to live that out, in order to actually apply the principle of liberty. You have to have those things to serve as frames of reference for actual patterns of living that we pursue each day.
So, maybe not everything, but much of what you've said to me so far, I think would rightly critique a classical liberal, a libertarian, a Rousseauian, a progressive, and put us more in a traditionalist conservative camp. But I wanted to ask you, because there's another sort of offshoot from that could probably be added to everything you're saying, which is kind of the Patrick Deneen model, right? The why liberalism failed. It rightly, in my view, offers all of the exact critiques you have said, but
Mhm.
its conclusions are almost, and it even roots itself in a Burkean model or understanding of traditions and order. Then it concludes, based on that the entire American experiment, the small L classical liberalism, the tree is poisoned from the root, right? That it started off wrong, and that what in fact traditional conservatives are or ought to be doing is not conserving a liberal tradition, but recognizing that liberalism, again, classical small L liberalism, cannot be conserved. It's poisonous from the root down, because all it does is accentuate the individual's importance to the point that it eventually dissolves all responsibilities for institutions. Um, where do you come down on sort of Deneen's approach? Does he go too far, or is that more the sort of, I'll call it, traditional conservative Burkean tradition you're arguing for?
No, I'm not an integralist. I'm not a Catholic integralist, and I'm not a magisterial Christian nationalist in the mold of a Stephen Wolfe or a Douglas Wilson. Um, there is a what there's two people that I quote a lot in the book, and one of them is Russell Kirk, who is, famous. Your audience will know him. He's famous for having written The Conservative Mind in 1953. And that book has always served as the intellectual basis for traditionalist conservatism in America since 1953. It's in its seventh edition. It's still in print. The author of many other books, but that's probably his most well-known book. And then another figure named Peter Viereck, who's less well-known, but Peter Viereck wrote a book called Conservatism Revisited in the year 1949, and another book called Conservatism from John Adams to Churchill in 1956. Is a less well-known person, but his ideas are very much in line with Kirk, and in some ways even with William F. Buckley, who Buckley didn't like Peter Viereck all that much. They had some personal differences. But one thing that both Kirk and Viereck identified in American order, American tradition, American identity, if you want to call it that, or American character, is rooted in various cultures in the past. So the way that Kirk talks about it in his book Roots of American Order, he looks at various cities. He looks at Athens and Rome and Jerusalem and London and Philadelphia. These five cities are the frames of reference for American order.
We should probably clarify there that he looked at colonial America, Philadelphia, not modern day Philadelphia.
Yeah, like the Phillies, Karen, not that Philadelphia.
Right.
Colonial Philadelphia. Um, yeah, each of these particular cities have a particular historical location. And then Viereck does something similar. He doesn't look at cities, but he looks at civilizations. He looks at the ancient Greek civilization, ancient Roman, and he looks at the Jewish civilization as laid out in the Old Testament, and then also the Christian civilization of the medieval period. And he says that the Greeks gave us beauty, the Romans gave us law, the Jews gave us I'm forgetting. I have to go back and look it up. Jews gave us something important, something like law, and then the Christians gave us an ethic predicated on love. Okay, so I say all these things to say this, that what my project is trying to do is retrieve something. That's what Patrick Deneen's trying to do. He's on a retrieval project. That's what someone like Stephen Wolfe is trying to do. It's a retrieval project. But what they're trying to retrieve is something foreign to American order, and that is the constitutional order. The constitutional order is what we've always had since our national founding, with the exception of a few years in the 1780s. But since 1789, we've had the Constitution, and the Constitution has given us a federal system. It has established a particular relationship between the states and the federal government. It is, of course, comprised of checks and balances between the institutions of government and the branches of government. as well as the states and the federal government and the localities. All that is basic civics. And what I hope to recover is federalism. I'm not seeking for us to go to a model that Americans have never had before. That is an integralist model between a established church and a monarchy. I'm not looking to throw out the Constitution in favor of establishing a Christian prince that is a king priest with the Presbyterian Church as our established church. No, I think what we need to do is to rejuvenate the American federal system that the Constitution shows us. Now, one objection is, and I hear this all the time, well, the Constitution doesn't work. The Constitution has failed, just like Deneen's thesis. Liberalism has failed. You extend that to the Constitution. Constitution's failed. Nobody, we've got a government that doesn't enforce its own laws from the federal level all the way down to the local level. There's no respect for any of the laws. There's no respect for the Constitution. Congress can't. Congress has abrogated all of its responsibilities. On and on and on. And I acknowledge all of that. All of that is right. And it's good to catalog all these failures to keep them before our eyes. But the question remains: if the Constitution has failed, then what happened in 2024? I mean, people on the right love it that Trump won in 2024. How did he win? He won by constitutional procedure. So it can't have totally failed, because not only did Trump win in 2024, he also came back from a devastating loss in 2020. Or if you want to say he didn't really lose, he at least came back from a devastating repudiation in 2020. And he returns in 2024 through what? Constitutional methods. He didn't seize control of the government. He didn't have an insurrection. I don't think that he inspired an insurrection in 2021. I think it was a riot. It wasn't an insurrection. All this to say, the Constitution is our system. And as a traditional American conservative in the John Adams and Edmund Burke model, we should retrieve that. That's what we have. That's what we've lived with. That's what's proven itself worthy of our trust and our confidence. Has it failed? Yes. Is it perfect? No. But traditionalist conservatives are not interested in the perfect. We know that that's not possible. We're interested in a governmental system and a society that sets the conditions for us to be able to pursue our own human flourishing according to our own lights, our own talents, our own resources, and our own family, local, societal traditions.
So what you just said would be a perfect segue for me asking you about aspirational conservatism as you're defining it, but I want to table that for a moment before we get off this point. Patrick, when you make the statement that Patrick Deneen or Wolf are trying to retrieve something foreign to the American founding via the constitutional order, I think that's and I think Deneen would entirely agree with that, or at least in Why Liberalism Failed. I think he fully acknowledges, look, I'm talking about something that is not part of, or maybe to put it a different way, he would maybe harken back to an older understanding of the religious origins. But even then, he would have to acknowledge, as a Catholic, we've never had a true integralist, maybe you could say in the state of Maryland to a certain degree, but nothing truly like that. And so he would say, look, yes, I recognize what I'm trying to retrieve is an older understanding of conservatism that can be dated back, say, to the Middle Ages of Christendom that we could bring here to the West.
Right.
When I hear, and I know this is a loaded term, Christian nationalists, because the majority of people who I think could rightly be described as Christian nationalists do not use that term. It's sort of a loaded term that they recognize as more pejorative. But those who express a view not of Catholic integralism, right? We're not trying to give control over the Pope of Rome, but maybe as you suggested, maybe the Presbyterian Church, maybe the Southern Baptist, maybe some general sense of a Christian milieu in the United States. Do you get the sense that they share Patrick Deneen's understanding that this is actually a break from the American tradition? And the reason I ask that is because oftentimes what they seem to suggest is, no, we were a Christian nation. We're trying to get back to being a Christian nation.
Yeah. So Stephen Wolfe, I think, in fairness to him, I think he does sort of say that. He has a whole chapter on the New England state of affairs prior to 1831 and the disestablishment of the state churches. I mean, his argument is that, all the colonies had state churches, all the states had state churches up until 1831 or 1832. I think Connecticut was the last of the states to get rid of a state established church. And yes, I think that that's right. However, Wolf also insists that his thesis is not predicated or justified at all by history or historical precedent. He's trying to make an argument. He's trying to make a rationalist argument that is tightly coherent. He says at the beginning of his book that if you're going to dispute my thesis, then you have to have an equally coherent argument, because it's one coherent argument. You have to demonstrate where I'm being incoherent with a coherent argument of your own. So he denies that he's going to use history. He denies that he's going to point to some kind of example in the past. He denies that he's a conservative.
I'm about to say those two statements right there are not very conservative.
That's right. He denies being a conservative. He says, I'm not a conservative. But in fairness to him, he does devote a whole chapter or two to New England prior to 1830, and for the exact reasons that you just said. Now, what I would say about Stephen Wolfe is granting him that, and granting him even that that he is right in claiming historically, making the historical claim that America was once a Christian nation between 1790 and 1965. I mean, I can give you a specific date almost. Protestantism is the predominant religious tradition in America. Historians call it the Protestant consensus, that American culture is defined by. That's not in dispute. That's true. But what Wolfe is actually calling for, what his program calls for, is the establishment of a church, a state established church from the federal level, as well as a figure he calls the Christian Prince, that holds executive, legislative, and judicial power. And the magistrate and the church operate in conjunction, but it is an Erastian system in which the state is over the church. He says that the Christian Prince is supreme even over the office of pastor. That's foreign to America.
Mm-hmm.
That's not that kind of a setup was never found in any of the states.
Yeah, and granted, most of the time when I'm hearing this, it's not from someone trying to make, say, a coherent argument in it, and I don't want to besmirch anyone's intelligence, but it tends to be less of that dude wrote a book, but more somebody who spent 15 minutes on on Google trying to figure out what our religious heritage was, and has concluded we're I don't have a problem saying we're a Christian nation if we can get around to defining what that means.
What that is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I wrote a whole book on that.
Oh, you did? Okay. Well, maybe you can help me here then, because this is something that I think is in relation to that idea. And he wasn't the only one. There are a lot of conservative forefathers who themselves were not Christian, but were yet very deferential to Christianity within the United States context, recognizing its value and necessity, if you will.
Yeah, sure.
In our liberal project. Irving Kristol's one who comes to mind, who talked about this entire idea of sort of the secularist pursuit of, could we in fact establish this sort of small r Republican virtues necessary that the founder said we needed to keep a secular society going without Christianity? Could it be done? And his conclusion was no. And again,
that's right.
He was Jewish. He was not a Christian. Or rather than just saying no, he said yes, but only for a time. Eventually, you run out of juice. Eventually, once you cut that tree off, you've lost the nourishing roots where these come from. The problem, however, is that it does not appear a person can short-circuit the system by just saying, well, here are the values we need. In other words, if we had nothing but a society of Irving Kristols who were not themselves professing this particular religion, but recognizing its importance, it seemed like that too would not be enough. It seemed like there is some sort of, and I'll call it a balance. I'm a professing believing Christian myself. I know with a very deep conviction that Christ did not die on a cross so that you and I could have a really cool system of government. I know that's not the purpose of the Gospels. I
Right.
also know that this seems
Agreed.
to work best when there is a broader, I'll call it Christian worldview pervasive in a culture that allows for tradition and liberty. And I think because of that, these things get a little messy, and you end up with people with good intentions who seem to think it is their duty as Christians to essentially evangelize the nation, trying to pull from what is that verse in Chronicles about if my people will turn to me, I will heal their
7:14.
land.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And so how do you balance this sort of what is the need for an evangelical message, say, for a secular government to work? And when does that cloud the, say, evangelical need of actually reaching souls for the cause of Christ?
Well, I think that's a great question because I think that's the issue that Stephen Wolfe is addressing in his book more than anything else. His book, Case for Christian Nationalism. His his conception of the purpose of government is different than what the constitutional conception of the purpose of government is. If you look at the preamble, he thinks, and Patrick Dean, I think, is similar in this regard. But Wolfe says that the purpose of government is to secure its citizens heavenly good. That's the phrase he uses. It's heavenly good. So that means that this both the state and the church define what the heavenly good is. So what is the heavenly good? Well, that people would come to know Christ and be saved. And when they die, but then when they're alive, that uh, they are being sanctified, and they are being sanctified through um, Christian morality that is laid down in the scriptures, in the Ten Commandments, and in the law, and in the moral law that's in the Sermon on the Mount and everything else. So that's our heavenly good. Our heavenly good is to be faithful to Christ, to live a life that's faithful to Christ, and then die and go to heaven. That's our heavenly good, and that's what the purpose of government is for. But what does the preamble of the Constitution say? I mean, the purpose of government is to establish domestic tranquility, promote the general welfare, have a common defense. What are all these things for? These things are all for the citizens to have a set of conditions by which they may pursue flourishing according to their own lights and their own gifts and talents, the way that they decide. So the citizens, societies decide what the highest good is. I get to decide what the good is for myself and my family. Um, and the government then sets the conditions for that to be possible. Thus, religious freedom. The church gets to fulfill its commission from Matthew 28 without any hindrance from the state, without the state saying anything about it, without the state putting up a roadblock in the way of the church, or without the state defining what the Great Commission means. The state doesn't interpret scripture. The state doesn't come in and try to become a bunch of theologians. It doesn't try to help at all. Whenever the state tries to help the church in the last 1700 years since Constantine, usually it's gone wrong in some way. But that's exactly what Wolf thinks is needed. That the state can come along and help the church pursue its global mission, and that's not what the state's for. That's that's the state stepping out of its temporal jurisdiction and stepping into a spiritual jurisdiction where it doesn't belong. So that I think gets what your question gets to is, what is the purpose of government? And I don't go with a classical liberal sort of Lockean view that the purpose of government is to secure and maintain people's rights, because then people just decide what those rights are. And here we are with, gay marriage and transing your kids and the whole 9 yards and the whole shebang, right? If the purpose of government is to secure rights, then I can just define what my rights are, and by common
In all fairness,
majoritarian.
John Locke never argued for transitioning your kids.
Wait, he didn't? Oh, wow, shocker. But when you have a majoritarian tyranny, when you have an omnipotence of the majority, which of course you do in a democracy, yeah, that becomes the state of affairs. Now, one thing I wanted to mention before we get too far afield is when Tocqueville came to America in 1831, and he wrote Democracy in America, and both volumes are published by 1840. He makes a statement that when he came to America, 50 years, of course, have gone or 40 years since the enactment of the Constitution. He sees that Americans are not really that virtuous, that Republican virtue is not common. But he says that Americans are deeply religious, and that the Christian religion informs the mores of the culture, the customs, the conventions of the culture more than anything else. In fact, the mores themselves are more powerful even than the laws, because the laws come from the mores, and the mores emerge from Christian morality. Even though there are all these different Christian groups and denominations and sects, everybody agrees on Christian morality. So through the mores, through what he calls self-interest rightly understood, through voluntary societies on the local level, and through federalism, a proper relationship of the states to the federal government that he spends a great deal of time talking about in Volume 1, you have a democratic republic that does not tend towards the tyranny of the majority. It actually maintains and secures freedom. And back to the definition of freedom, Tocqueville gets his definition of freedom from John Winthrop, first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, who defined freedom in explicitly moral terms: active participation in the life of the community or of a society through the exercise and enjoyment of rights and duties. A moral category. Freedom is a moral category. So, all those things that Tocqueville says, I think that's a lot more helpful than pointing to, John Adams on the need for virtue in a republic. I mean, all that, of course, is possible to be done, but it's a little bit more abstract. Whereas Tocqueville's observations are much more concrete, and I think a much healthier starting point, because the problem, I think, with the problem that we're all trying to get our heads around, at least on the right, the thing that unites, a Deneen or a Wolf with a traditionalist conservative, is the threat of omnipotent majoritarian tyranny in a democracy. And so we hear the left constantly talking about the need to preserve and protect our democracy. Well, we don't really have a democracy. We have a democratic republic. We have a tradition of republicanism that is applied through some, not all, democratic means. So we don't have a democracy. If we did have a democracy, then the tyranny of the majority would just run amok all the time. So I think that's the thing that we can all agree on. We're all trying to figure out how to prevent that, how to prevent the omnipotence of the majority. And I think that's a good thing to unite around. I think a lot of times we focus on our differences and how we disagree with one another. And of course, all this plays out on Twitter, or formerly known as Twitter, X.
I still call it Twitter.
I know, I can't help it. But there's actually a lot more that unites our sides, our side on the right, than divides us.
So maybe that would be a good time then to turn to and I don't know if you coined the term aspirational conservatism, but I know that plays a central role in your message. What is Kirk talks about conservatism being a disposition, if you will. How flesh that out for me? What is aspirational conservatism? It's almost this notion that you can't truly be a conservative. You're just trying to get there.
Mm-hmm. I do say that. Conservatism is an aspiration itself, because conservatism is not just an ideology. It's not just a philosophy. Conservatism is concrete expression of beliefs lived out, convictions lived out in your life, and those concrete expressions are applied in your life in a million ordinary ways. That's one of the most important things that sets us apart from the left. The left has they're trying to build castles in the sky. They're utopian. They want to change the world. They want you to fulfill your all your potential. They say you can be whatever you want to be. Well, what does all that even mean? I don't even know what I want to be. You ask me what I want to be when I grow up. I'm 56. I don't even know. I don't know. I'm just trying to survive today, Josh. I'm just trying to be faithful with what I have to do today. The message of Ecclesiastes is a beautiful expression of conservatism in the Bible. You're not going to change the world. That shouldn't be your aspiration. Changing the world is castles in the sky. You shouldn't set as your life goal to fulfill your destiny. Well, that's great for Star Wars. That's not great for actual living or to fulfill your highest potential. Well, that sounds great in a first grade assembly and inspiring, and it draws a tear to one's eye. But none of it's realistic. None of it has anything to do with the actual world that we live in that's sinful and fallen and throws up obstacles that surprises us in good ways and bad ways. So to be a conservative is always wrapped up in an aspiration to become the kind of person that is virtuous, that is faithful, that is stewarding something for a generation that's coming behind you, um, that recognizes that we have limits, but those limits are not bad. The limits are good. I don't have $10 million, and I'm glad I don't, because I would be a terrible person with $10 million. I know myself pretty well. I mean, what is the story of everybody that's ever won a big lottery payout? Their life always, implodes. So limits are good. We have a world of limits. God made this world with limits. Freedom is limited, and responsibility is limited. So that's why I say that there's no such thing as a pure or a true conservative, because conservatism is concrete. Conservatism is an aspiration. We're all sort of on the path. We're trying to achieve uh, a conservatism, but we have to discipline ourselves through self-restraint to get there. But ultimately, I think that aspirational conservatism is looking to the best of tradition in the West more broadly and in America more specifically, in the interest of self-improvement and improvement of our society on the basis of virtue, the theological virtues that we see in 1 Corinthians 13 and the classical virtues that are championed by people like Aristotle and Cicero. Ultimately, what kind of a person, Josh, do you and I want to be? What kind of people do we want to be? That's what conservatism is all about, striving and reaching towards those things. Looking up to God, looking behind us to tradition, looking all around us to those who we love in our society and are committed to and work with and struggle with and fail with and succeed with, always in the interest of actual people to move forward into the future. I think that's what I'm trying to say in aspirational conservatism, and it is a disposition. It's not like an argument against Kirk, but it's a disposition of aspiration. It's an optimistic one too. It's Americans have always been optimistic people. We've never been a bunch of curmudgeons. That's not American. Americans have laughed at themselves. Americans are confident in their institutions, confident in who they are, and they step out into the world with confidence. Sometimes we're wrong. Sometimes we get it wrong. But then when we do get it wrong, Americans, like no other people, seek to correct our mistakes. And sometimes we go too far, like tearing down statues and hating on the American flag. Those things are unnecessary. But we have sought to correct the mistakes that we have made in real ways. And it matters to us when we have made mistakes in the past as a people. And those are good things.
Hmm. I'm curious there. I heard the editorialist George Will once say that, as a young man, he became a dreary conservative. He was not, and I think there is this sort of, and I will admit, I have a natural bent not toward optimism. and I think some of that, the notions of limitations, of trade-offs, of say, utopian thinking can lend themselves, I don't want to say to pessimism, but to a more like possibly stark or dare I say stoic view of reality.
Mm-hmm,
And so
mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could comment more on that, because it and the person that stands out in my mind is Ronald Reagan, is the one that kind of squared that circle of,
Yeah,
it seems
agreed.
like in a normal, the normal default for a conservative movement, let's take it outside the United States, just anywhere on earth, normally conservatives would be the more, straight-laced, stiff necktie kind of, kind of killjoys in the room. And yet it seemed like Reagan tapped into something in the American spirit that combines this bizarre conservatism with this we can do it attitude.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I like the way you said that. Um, we know, you and I, Josh, both know that in very important ways in our lives and in our families, we have been dealt the cards that we've been dealt, and we didn't have a say in it. You can't choose your own family. You can't choose your parents. You can't choose where you were born. You can't choose the time you were born. You're dealt the hand that you're dealt, and that's it. That's a realistic appraisal of life. And so you start with the hand that you're dealt. You don't look at the hand you're dealt and throw them aside and demand another hand. That's what the progressive left wants to do. That's what the 1619 Project sought to do. And you know what? I mean, with respect to my friends on the right, that's what magisterial Christian nationalists want to do too. In declaring the constitutional project a failure, let's start over with an established church and a monarchy. No, I demand a new hand. We're starting the game over. Well, that's just not how life works. I had a question today. I was talking about the book today with a group of members at my church this morning at 7:00 a.m. I'm not a morning person. And somebody asked me, well, what do you say about the state of affairs that we're in, where the government has thrown the doors open to immigration, such that, I mean, what has the effect, I should say, of completely undermining American culture and making sort of a pluralism and a diversity a religion of its own. Um, so that, what does it mean to be an American? Hardly even, you can't even really answer the question anymore, and it doesn't really matter anymore, because we're all citizens of the world now. It's what the federal government has done since 1965, throwing open the gates, as it were.
I'm assuming this individual listens to a lot of Fox News.
Well, I don't know if it's Fox News, but I think I don't know. I don't know what he listens
Just a
to, but
daily drip of immigration stories, it sounds like.
immigration stories, yeah. But I think, I mean, at first I wanted to say, well, I'm not really, I didn't really write the book with a bunch of, policy prescriptions and things that I think we should do. I don't really say that. And that's true, I don't. But as he was asking the question, I thought, actually, no, that's actually a pretty good question. So how do you apply aspirational conservatism to a real question like that? And I mean, this is what he was pushing me to get into. And there's a million questions we could ask that are related, like that. What do we do when we face the situations like we face today? And it goes back, I think, to, I'm probably a little bit older than you. I was born in 1969. I came into a world that looked like it did. And you were born, I guess, probably a little bit later than that. And you came into a world, you encountered a world that was a certain way before you got here. The problems that we have in our country, these problems that divide us the most, almost all of them are really old problems and really old questions, and they were issues in the culture long before we were aware that they were issues. So we can't just say, well, let's go back to 1830. Let's go back and have state churches. Let's just forget the whole 200 years of the past, and let's go back and pick at random a moment that we like in the past and say that's what we want. No, that's not a realistic assessment of the world we live in. It's one of our limits, actually. We've been dealt the hand we've been dealt. So let's look at the problems that we see, and based on shared convictions, a shared reverence of tradition, which I think that integralists and Christian nationalists definitely have, and a shared commitment to local societies, and starting with the best of our traditions in the West and in America. How do we address a problem like rampant immigration and the undermining of an American culture that our grandparents would have had? If we want to recover something like that, I think that's a great goal to have. But there's a couple of things we need to recognize. One, it's going to take a long time. It took a long time to get to this point. It's like losing weight. When you're 50 pounds overweight, it took a long time to get there. It's going to take a long time to get out of it. So it's going to take a long time to address that particular problem, or a problem like the secularization in society. It's taken 150 years or more for America to drip, drip, drip reach the point of secularization that we're in now. It's going to take a long time to get out of it. And you and I, Josh, might not see it. We might be like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We've received the promise, but we're not gonna see the fulfillment of it. We might be like Moses. We might be able to see off in the distance the fulfillment of the promise, but we're not going to get to enter the land. But that's okay. That's okay. Because you know who does get to enter the land? You know who does get to see a retrieval of the good things in our culture? Our children and our grandchildren. And that's worth it. That's what makes it all worthwhile. We might not see it. We might see nothing but failure. But if my 20-year-old and my 16-year-old daughters can see it sometime in their lifetime, I can die satisfied.
I, that's a beautiful response. I say often on this podcast, look, we might not see it,
Yeah.
all sorts of things we might hope for. And I say that with an eye to the history of this country, of those who, and I know you're talking about something much broader than this, but if I think just of the modern conservative movement that kind of arguably began in 1953 with Kirk's book, and then kind of culminated with the 1964 election,
Hmm.
super loss of that election.
Yeah.
All of those conservatives of that era, they didn't know what the future looked like. To them, that was
No.
their one shot, one and done. A lot of them probably died and did not get to see it. But had it not been for them, none of this would have happened. And I say that in view with, as you're describing, aspirational conservatism. Something else I often caution, I guess, the listener is the sort of traditional conservatism I'm advocating, and that I understand you to be advocating, is one that necessarily requires a high degree of maturity in the individual to truly hold. And I think sometimes one of the challenges, if you will, of conservatism is not so much that we don't have the right arguments or the right spokespeople, even though that's a big challenge, because these
Yeah.
days, if you throw
Yeah.
around the term conservative, you can mean a lot of different people,
Absolutely.
some of who I don't want to be associated with.
Sure.
Um, that being said, I think it also necessitates a culture that is receptive to ideas that are not maybe as exciting, not as utopian. You mentioned earlier, it makes sense at a high school to be all you can be, live your best life, sort of thing. But that's something that I think the culture hungers for in absence of some other thing, and by which I mean something else that they can derive purpose and some sort of a energy toward. And this is something
Hmm.
I see a lot in Kirk. I definitely see it in Edmund Burke. These are my terms, not theirs. That they seemed very concerned about trying to recapture the magic. That it's not just a stoic matter of kind of a bland, we're doing this because it works. It's not utilitarian,
Right.
but that there
Right.
really is a deep spiritual excitement, if you will, to living in accordance, I guess, with what you might say is God's reality. And so I'm wondering, can you speak to that? It might relate earlier to the conversation we're having about the need for a vibrant Christianity. That's one means of getting it. But can you speak to that? Do you see the culture as what I would call sick, as desiring something so much that it's hard for a conservative worldview to be sticky because there's no magic out there anymore? They're having to vaunt themselves up, be all I can be, because where else are they going
Yeah.
to find it?
Yeah. I think that's really well said. I dedicated the book to my daughters and to their generation. That's why I love your podcast. Your podcast is has an audience in mind, and an audience of millennials and younger, I suppose, as well. And the book is really aimed at younger people, younger than me. I'm a Gen Xer, people younger than me, because the generation of millennials and Gen Z have not had anybody to look up to in the conservative movement. In my generation and then my parents' generation had William F. Buckley. You know, they had Ronald Reagan, they had Margaret Thatcher, they had George Shultz. They had Irving Kristol, as you mentioned him a second ago. They had these incredible men and women who were wonderful conservative people and thinkers and lived their lives in an inspiring way and stood against real threat, like real threat, and were absolutely unafraid. Thatcher and Reagan, they laugh in the face of Soviet communism, but the laughter they have is not diabolical. It's the joie de vivre. It's a joy of life. And it was a joy of life that defeated communism at the end of the day. And we are missing that. And it does make a culture sick when there are no inspiring figures to look to. I mean, it's not, yeah, Trump inspires a lot of people. I mean, there are people out there that are inspirational that people look to and follow on social media and so forth, but not like in earlier times. I've been watching episodes of Firing Line on YouTube. The Hoover Institution has preserved a whole bunch of episodes. I recommend them to your listeners to go on YouTube and just watch Firing Line. Just watch William F. Buckley. I mean, the guy had that show from 1965 until uh, what 2000 and something. I mean, it was like a 35-year run. It was the longest running political commentary television show in the history of the medium. And watch how he interacts with people. I listened to him give an interview, and the interviewer asked a question: of all the people that you interviewed, was there anybody that you just didn't like, that you personally didn't like? And he interviewed a lot of really crazy people,
Mm-hmm.
wild. Anybody who's ever seen Firing Line knows. And a lot of people who had really bad and really terrible beliefs on the left and then also on the right as well. And it was fascinating. There's only one person that he didn't like in all of those interviews and in all those years, and it was Gore Vidal.
Yeah.
It's the only one he didn't like. But everybody else, he genuinely liked. One person I was really surprised by. He genuinely liked and respected Jesse Jackson. I grew up when I was in high school. Jesse Jackson was running for president. I thought he was a joke, and I thought he was an idiot. I thought he was ridiculous. I thought he was a total showman and a race hustler and all the rest. No. William F. Buckley said no. He's a serious man, serious ideas that we need to be serious about. He had him on he had him on Firing Line more than once. That's amazing. And so what I would say is that through a cultivation of an imagination that is rooted in the conviction that God is the ground of all being, I think is the beginning point. To read history in a way that is, as you said, mature. It's a mature. You read history in order to form your conscience. I didn't invent that. I got that from a historian that I love named John Lukacs. And only children are unable to see nuance in life. They can only see things in black and white. They can only see things in terms of good and bad. But a fully formed conscience, a mature conscience, can see that there's darkness in history, but the dark things in history don't have to be the final word. In fact, a good historian, will recognize the darkness in history, but also will see that there is also light in the past, because human nature is ultimately a tension between what we see in Psalm 8, that we're created a little bit lower than the angels, and Romans 3, that that the wages of sin is death. We're created in God's image with unspeakable dignity, but we are sinners. We are depraved. And history plays out that human nature and that tension. But God is always going to have the final say. And so we don't have to end the story with focusing only on moral stain, with no possibility of atonement and reconciliation. Of course we can. But we don't know how to read history. We take history in like a Star Wars movie. It's a simple good versus evil narrative. But that's not right. So I like the way you start off the question by pointing to maturity and the sickness in our culture. I think that curing that sickness, it's a serious task, and it requires serious people with a serious disposition and who are committed to virtue in their lives. And that requires a great deal of circumspection, and it requires tradition. We can't do it if our attitude is that, in a sense, to hell with the people in the past, and to hell with people who are to come. Society is only about me. That I think that's the way to aggravate the sickness, and ultimately society will just die of it.
I think that's very well said. The name of the book, of course, Religious Freedom, A Conservative Primer. Poor title, but excellent book. John Wilsey, so good to talk to you. Thank you for fleshing these things out for you, and thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Thanks, Josh. It's been great to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.